thank Simon again officially on the recording for doing this and taking the trouble to read the book and share these fantastic facts with us. So I'll mute myself and hand over to Simon.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. So I'm going to go till about 25 past or so, and that'll give us a bit of time for questions and thoughts and things, because I think this is a hopefully quite a thought-provoking book, thought-provoking subject, and there's quite a lot to discuss around it, I think. So the book is Tomorrow's People by a guy called Paul Morland, subtitled The Future of Humanity in 10 Numbers. So it's a follow-up to a book that he wrote, which was more of a history book, which was sort of bringing the demographic angle on patterns in world history, really, over the past couple of 100 years, which I've got and I haven't read yet. But that's I think the bigger selling book, because it's been around a bit longer and it was quite a big hit. This is the follow-up to it, and it's more looking at the future. And I think what's really interesting about it and what got me buying it and reading it was just these projections about the direction in which global population's going broadly. So it's all about demographics and it's all about population. I'm not a numbers person, but so there's a little bit of grappling with numbers here, but there's nothing too complicated, I think. I think it's all sort of understandable. There's a few little charts on there that I will talk people through, so you don't have to be baffled by sort of quantity charts. But before we start, because we're talking about population and demographics, I realized when I was writing it, actually this gets into quite sensitive topics for some people. So I have a little thing I'm going to say just before we start, because the way Paul writes about this subject, it's the way you have to write about it. It's about deaths and births and fertility and all these sorts of things, and how different countries are on different tracks on this. This will be a bit sensitive for some people. You know, you may have sort of had personal issues or experiences recently. If so, this may not be the presentation for you. I'm not going to be talking in detail about that, but there's going to be a lot of talk about mortality and deaths and births and things. So just to make people aware of that. Who is Paul Morland? So Paul Morland is, he's sort of one of the leading demographers really in the world. He's he did a fellowship, I think, at Oxford up the road from me here, but he's not here anymore. But he's basically attached to Birkbeck, I think. And he's this is from his website. He's on TV a bit as a talking head. You'll see him popping up. He'll be on the radio talking about demographics. Kind of him and Danny Dorling, I think, is the other guy that you'll generally see a lot on this topic. And Danny Dorling actually helped with this book as well. So yeah, he's a real global expert. No, I managed to actually talk to him because a bit of an aside from this, he'd also written about Northern Ireland, where I'm from, where there are some very interesting demographics. So I wanted to talk to him about that for a little piece, and I got my first ever piece in the Belfast Telegraph. This was last week, so I was very thrilled. This was my interview with Paul about Northern Ireland demographics. But while I had him, and as I was doing this talk, I also asked him a few things about his book. So I'll be scattering in a few quotes here and there from my own conversations with him. Nothing that different from the book, but just some unique things for the AQR for this particular talk. So let's get into it. One thing I need to put up front: don't be baffled by this chart. You could spend a long time looking at it. It's called demographic transition, and it's just one of the basic concepts that underpins the whole book, really. And what he's saying is that around the world, the same process of demographic transition is going on. So it may look like the demographics in Sudan or in Japan or here are very, very different, but actually they're, as he sees it, just at different stages of the same cycle. So, and the cycle is broadly this: that you kind of start off with a high birth rate and a high death rate. So if we go back a couple of hundred years ago, pretty much all the world was like this, lots of deaths, lots of births, and that evened itself out. You had a fairly even sort of population. What then started happening though was medicine got better, death rates started coming down, and crucially, before the birth rates did. So that's when you got a population explosion. So in the 19th century in Europe, we had a huge population explosion. And as he writes in his other book about how demographics affects world politics and the world generally, that population explosion in Europe in the 19th century was a lot of what was behind colonialism, actually. We had an awful lot of people in Europe who, and not enough land and not enough opportunities. So we were sending people out all over the world. Things have changed quite a lot since then, as we will see. So yes, that's just to make that point that, yeah, the death rate tends to go down first. You get a big population explosion, but actually the birth rate follows. I think this is what a lot of people maybe don't quite realize, is that for maybe slightly more obscure reasons, the birth rate, people start having fewer children. And eventually you get to some sort of rough parity, but you both have a low death rate and a low birth rate. So things plateau out again, as you see on the red line there. So I won't labor that, but that sort of underpins a lot of what's going on in the book. So population trends shape history. So as Paul sees it, he divides things into pre-modern, which is the high fertility and the high mortality. Then you have the medicine and food supply improving, and you get population explosions. Then you have what he calls modern, so low fertility and low mortality, which is sort of where we are in the West, but actually also in China and increasingly India at the moment, which I'll come on to talk about. That's the sort of modern situation. And then he's projecting forward to what's going to happen next. And it's much more of a mixed picture. So it's, fertility rates around the world are falling below replacement level in many, many places. I'll explain that in a bit, what replacement level is. Actually, I'll just do it now. It's basically replacement level. It's a term he commonly uses. It's the level of births you need to keep the population at a kind of steady number. So it's basically sort of 2.1 children per female. It is broadly what you need to keep the sort of population steady. So when we've got a rate below that, it means basically the population longer term will basically shrink. So at the moment, we've got some societies getting smaller and getting older, but others are growing, partly because there are different stages in the cycle, but actually also they've been through the cycle, some of these, and they're still growing for different reasons. Israel is one of those, and I'll come to that in a bit. So the differences there are down to beliefs and attitudes more than economics. So a lot of the growth or not growth before was down to largely sort of economic factors in a way. But now we're at a stage where it's much more about choice and the way people want to live their lives. So the problem, this is sort of the big headline really, the problem for humanity in the near future will not be too many children, but too few. So we hear a lot about the global population going up and up and up, and can the world handle this number of people? So he says it's likely to go on growing for at least into the 2060s. Some others think a lot longer than that, right up to the end of this century. But most, including Paul, think it will peak at about 11 billion people sometime later on this century. Now that seems like a lot more than now, but actually that's not the whole story. So the growth is likely to come at the moment from areas like sub-Saharan Africa, where things are growing quite a lot at the moment. We're just in that phase there where sort of health has improved, but infant mortality has gone down a lot, but people are still having a lot of kids. So big growth there. But most of the West and China as well, and India is on the way to joining them, have fast falling fertility rates. And eventually most of the developing countries will go that way too. So what are the 10 numbers? I'll rattle through this one because I've got a slide for each one, and that's really the rest of what I'm going to talk through. So infant mortality, so 10 per thousand in Peru. Number 2, population growth, 4 billion will be the population of Africa by 2100. Urbanization, so there are currently 121 cities in China with over a million people in them, which is pretty mind-boggling. Fertility, so 1, that's Singapore, which is I think one of the lowest in the world. That's their total fertility rate. Remember, it should be 2.1, so it's about half of what it should be. That's pretty dramatic. Aging, 43 is the median age in Catalonia. That's really high. So that's one of the highest places in the world. Catalonia is not alone in that. Old age, the number of people in Japan over 100 years old, so that's now up to 79,000 people. So they have a real issue there, which I'll talk about in a bit. Population decline. He picks out Bulgaria for this one, but he could have picked Italy, Germany, a few other countries having similar issues. 55% decline in Bulgaria's population over the last 100 years. Ethnic change globally as well, so particularly in the West. So, in California, only 22% of school kids now are from white backgrounds. So, yeah, quite probably lower than most of us would think if we were to watch Hollywood. Education, 71% literacy now among Bangladeshi women, and this was previously one of the real black spots in the world for low literacy. It's really catching up. And food, 375% increase in cereal production in Ethiopia in the last 25 years. So Ethiopia obviously burned into a lot of our minds who were around in the 1980s as almost the worst example in the world of a sort of ecological disaster and a food production disaster. It's completely turned things around. Not completely, there's still poverty there, there's still all sorts of issues, but in terms of food production, that is absolutely remarkable. And it's mainly been done not by aid, but by what local people have done in terms of just changing practices. So we'll go through some of those figures just briefly, with just maybe a minute on each one or so. So this infant mortality, things, we talked about that before. So the chart there just shows Peru. If you look at the start of the charts, and so 1950 to 55, Peru's like well above the global average there for infant mortality rate. So that's usually down to just poor sort of healthcare, a lot of people having kids in kind of situations where there isn't a lot of medical help around, and it's also linked to poverty as well. But you can see how by 2015 to 2020 it's come right down. It's actually below the global average now. The quote there from Paul in the book is just sort of pointing out about that sort of leads to other changes ultimately. So he says, in time, lower infant mortality leads to lower fertility rates, partly because parents who expect to lose fewer children have fewer children, and partly because of the association of smaller families with prosperous lifestyles. So what we'll see is that birth rates then start to go down in these countries that are making these really good medical improvements. Population growth. So 4 billion as the population of Africa by 2100. I quite like this chart. So it shows that line is the proportion of the world's population that will be African. So yeah, we're looking at around a third by the end of the century. Around 1 in 3 people will be African. In 1950, what was it, about not far off 1 in 15 or something like that. So quite a big change, and we're thinking about 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 at the moment. So he says that makes humanity more African. We lead our lives rather oblivious of Africa, but it's going to be much more on the stage. So yeah, we can expect a lot more news stories about Africa, a lot more concern here and interest here in economic development there, not just in a sort of aid giving way, but in a sense of sort of Africa being where it's at really in terms of the developing population there and developing economies. He has, and this is just something he told me in the interview, that he said he has a gut instinct that African fertility rates won't collapse down quite like they have in a lot of other developing countries, because he thinks there's more of a culture across Africa of being what he calls pro-natalist, which is more of a kind of belief about, sort of birth being, having lots of children being a good thing. It's just a hunch he's got, but if he's right, then that line is going to continue to go up even after 2100. Urbanization then is one of the other big trends. So I love this quote that in 1800, just 6% of the world's population lived in towns. By 2007, half of humanity was urban. An estimate suggests that it will be more like 2/3 by 2050. And what that means is that again feeds into this whole trend. So he says in much of the world, town dwellers are better educated and their children are less likely to die at an early age. And they tend to have fewer of them for both these reasons. So it feeds into that, again, lower birth rate thing. We sometimes think of urbanization, I think, as being, the population explodes in these kind of mega cities like Mexico City and New Delhi and places like that, but actually not necessarily. That's one phase, but then it does start to go down again. Fertility, so this is at the center of it all. He just picks out the example of Singapore really as being quite an extreme one. And you can see just on the graph there, Singapore right at the bottom. In 1950, they were somewhere near the top, having, what's that, about between 6 and 7 children for every female there. And now it's 1. So that is a recipe longer term for real sort of population collapse. But I think, that's quite a small place. China is on a similar path. So his quote about China, I think, is really interesting from the interview I did with him. He says, China's already got a reducing population. Its workforce is shrinking. I think things look very, very bad for China. And he was talking really about the sort of lack of social security provision there is going to create real economic problems for them. India is interesting because it's actually, the rate's dropping. They're still having more kids. The population is going up, but the rate at which it's going up is slowing. And it's slowing in a more kind of sensible way, if you like. China's sort of crashing. India's going slowly in that direction. So he thinks it should be able to manage its population decline slightly better in terms of being able to plan for some of the sort of economic consequences. He talks in his quote about the UK as well. So he says, we've been sub-replacement in Britain since the early 70s. But it's only now we're saying, oh my goodness, we've got labour shortages everywhere, even with 1 million immigrants a year. It'll take India a long time. So it takes 50, 60, 70 years for some of these things to play out. Catalonia, we've sort of talked about aging populations. I'll flick through that one because I'm aware of the time, and I think we've sort of covered that. Old age, though, I want to talk a little bit about this because he talks about Japan as being, a kind of laboratory, really. So he says, Japan will be the laboratory we'll all have to watch. But the trouble is, if it worked out badly in Japan, it's not like we can say, well, we'll do something about it, because by then it'll be too late. It probably is already too late. We in the UK are inevitably heading in the Japanese direction. So the Japanese direction being, there's 1950 with tons of young people, not very many old people. And here's the projection for 2050 with, look at those age groups of 80 to 84. Sorry, it's very small, 75. I just kind of scanned this off the book, so it's not great quality. But you can see a bulge in post-retirement ages, actually, and tiny numbers of kids coming through, and not a big working age population to finance all those older people. He talks about the States being on a similar trajectory, but it's going to hit a bit later. So he said the problem is going to hit in the States later because the fertility rate was higher for longer, and the States can always turn the immigration tap on. The problem with Japan, he says, and why it's going to have more of a problem, is Japan isn't big into immigration. Just culturally, they don't really welcome it. So they've really committed to dealing with this problem without bringing in younger people from other countries to sort of help out. So that's the way Britain's largely dealt with it. You know, for all the railing against immigration you get in some parts here, we have had quite large levels of it, and that's been our way of dealing with some of the population issues that we've got. Japan isn't going to go that route, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. Okay, population decline. Bulgaria falling away here. The Israel situation, I just wanted to flag up. So he says, where Israel's interesting is they have a lot of support for IVF. They are highly educated, highly urbanized. So if we want to have successful countries that aren't building in demographic winters, that's probably where we need to look for some lessons. So he notes even the most secular groups there have replacement level fertility. So there's something Israel are doing, and we're not quite sure what, but they are managing to keep the population going. He has another book, this is a bit of a side thing, but he has another book about the potential effect of conflicts actually in boosting populations, and that might be part of it. But yeah, it's quite a sort of complicated thing. But Israel's one of the few countries in the world which is developed and which is actually growing its population at a relatively healthy rate. Ethnic change in California. So yeah, so we're looking at sort of, you know, our picture from the Hollywood movies, I guess, is, you know, it's still pretty white there. But, you know, the 2065 forecast is, you know, white people will be very much a minority overall, and 22% of school children there are white. And that's just sort of part of overall how kind of America's changing really quite rapidly. So they did have some quite strict immigration laws in like the 1920s. Those were eased in the 1960s, and basically we're seeing the results of that now. So it's gone from being a sort of melting pot of Europeans basically into a global melting pot there. So and I think quite an interesting UK figure is that lower quote where he says in 2017 nearly 30% of babies born in the UK had foreign-born mothers, a figure that rose to nearly 60% in London. So maybe it's not because I'm a Londoner. Okay, education touched on this really. So I think the really interesting quote here is in 1800 the world is estimated to have been nearly 90% illiterate, and today we're fast approaching 90% literacy. Okay, and then the final one is food. So Ethiopian cereal production going way up, and basically being able to provide, in theory, if it's distributed properly, provide for its growing population. So I mean the population there is still growing quite a lot, but the rate of growth has slowed. He says it's the opposite of what Malthus expected would happen. Ethiopia has significantly reduced its population growth rate while simultaneously achieving exponential growth in food production. So yeah, Malthus did not see that coming. Okay, just looking at something in the chat, I will come back to that. And final slide now, I think. What are the politicians planning to do? well, guess what? They're asleep at the wheel, as you would expect. But in a sense, there's not an awful lot they can directly do. So as he puts it, there are two reasons why politicians won't look at this. One is it's so far down the road. Why would you care? And secondly, there are no clear, easy, obvious fixes or even difficult fixes for states to make. So this is his new book that will be coming out, I think, in 2025. He says, so I'm writing a book at the moment called Procreate or Perish. I'm taking the gloves off. So yeah, that was his final word to me in the interview. And that's it, really. So that was a bit of a rattle through his book. There's loads in the book, loads that I think everybody will be interested in. Some of the best stuff is actually just some of the little factoids here and there. Too many for me to really touch on, but I would urge everybody to read it. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Okay, I will stop the share.
Well, thank you. I was fascinated. I've made loads of notes and loads of questions, but and Alison's put something on the chat. Does anybody want to pile in with questions? I'll turn the recording off unless everybody's happy to leave it on in case we have an interesting chat. But GDPR wise, I should probably turn it off. Let me stop that, and then we can interrogate Simon. How do I can't find the recording. There we go. There it is.